The summer sun hangs heavy over the Atchafalaya River in August 2021. When a volunteer dive team pushes their boat across the surface, their sonar begins to hum and reveal shapes beneath the water. At first, it looks like any other shadow, but the outline sharpens into something unnatural. A roof, a frame, a vehicle sealed away by 20 years of mud. Divers descend into the thick current, and their lights sweep across rusted metal. A flash of green paint forces the team to stop. They brush back layers of algae until the numbers on the license plate come through the darkness. The digits match exactly. It is Angela Whitmore's missing Ford Explorer, the same vehicle that disappeared in July 2001. The divers force the door open and a torrent of mud rushes out. Inside, they find bones curled in the driver's seat. A silver wedding ring still clings to one hand. Beside the remains lies an old Nokia phone, a torn wallet with faded family photographs, and a paper map marked with red ink around the bridge. In that moment, the story that Lafayette believed had gone cold comes alive again. For 2 decades, there had been only rumor and silence. Now the river itself has given back the truth. What really happened to Angela Whitmore that night in 2001? And whose hidden presence left DNA beneath her fingernails that was not her? Husbands, if you want to uncover the answers to these haunting questions, then like this video, and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and let us reach 5,000 likes to keep the investigation alive. On the riverbank, police vehicles gather, lights cutting across the dark water. The Bayou Recovery Unit lifts evidence bags one by one onto the deck. The crowd grows larger as whispers spread through Lafayette. After 2 decades of doubt, the car is found. The remains are found. And the secrets that once sank beneath the Atchafalaya have risen again. This is where the story of Angela Whitmore begins. The story now shifts back to July of 2001. Lafayette, Louisiana was caught in the thick of a southern summer. The air was heavy and still, the kind of heat that pressed down on rooftops and made the pavement shimmer. Families gathered on porches with sweet tea, fans turning slowly, while the river behind the town carried its restless current unseen. It was a place where everyone seemed to know everyone, and news traveled quickly from the grocery store to the church pew. In the heart of Lafayette lived Angela Whitmore. She was 32 years old, with a slender frame and eyes that often looked worried even when she smiled. She lived in a red brick home with white shutters, a house that had been part of the neighborhood for years. Friends remembered her as kind but hurried, often seen rushing to appointments or picking up her children, always carrying the weight of a busy life. Her husband, Charles Chuck Whitmore, was known as a quiet man. He kept to himself, spoke politely in public, and carried the reputation of a steady provider. He worked, he mowed his yard, and he brought the children to St. John's Church every Sunday. To outsiders, the Whitmore family looked complete. But those closest to Angela knew the household was not always as calm as it appeared from the street. Angela and Chuck had 2 young children, both too small to understand the tension that sometimes filled the house. To them, their father was dependable and their mother was loving. But shadows lingered behind closed doors. Those shadows were often visible to Helen, Angela's aging mother, who lived nearby. Helen worried constantly about her daughter. She would later say she saw fear in Angela's face in the weeks leading up to that summer night. Among Angela's closest friends was Linda Carver, who lived just a few miles away. Linda was the one who received late-night phone calls when Angela felt overwhelmed. Linda was also the one who later told police that Angela spoke of leaving her marriage, but had not yet found the strength to follow through. The Whitmore family's lives revolved around their community. The children attended school with neighbors. Chuck attended fundraisers with other parishioners at St. John's, and Angela volunteered whenever she could. It was a town where secrets were difficult to keep. Yet sometimes the deepest secrets were the ones hidden in plain sight. On warm summer nights, neighbors would sit on their porches, looking across at the Whitmore home, never suspecting that Within weeks, their quiet town would become the center of one of Louisiana's most haunting mysteries. Every story has a beginning, but it is often the ordinary details of a life that make its sudden end so unsettling. And in Lafayette, the summer of 2001 was about to turn ordinary evenings into whispered legends. On the evening of July 2001, the air in Lafayette was still heavy with summer heat when Angela Whitmore stepped out of her red brick home. It was around 8 o'clock when she slid into her green Ford Explorer, a vehicle the neighbors had grown used to seeing parked neatly in the driveway. She was headed to pick up her young daughter from a classmate's house, a short and ordinary drive that should have ended within minutes. But that drive would be the last time the neighborhood saw Angela behind the wheel. The hours after Angela left were cloaked in silence. Her Explorer never returned to the driveway. The house stayed dark, and the sound of her footsteps never reached the porch again. Inside, her husband Chuck later told police that he was sitting in the living room, watching television. Yet, when asked what program he had watched, or even the score of the game he claimed was on, his answers shifted and faltered. What stood out even more was his delay. He waited until after midnight, nearly 4 hours after Angela had left, to finally pick up the phone and report her missing. Investigators arriving at the Whitmore home noticed something strange right away. The family's landline had been disconnected that night. No calls in, no calls out. For a house that depended on that phone, the timing raised questions. Why had the line gone dead on the very night Angela vanished? Around the same time, neighbors along the stretch near the Atchafalaya River recalled something that haunted them later. A loud metallic sound rang out in the distance, like steel striking steel. Some even claimed they saw a pair of headlights cut across the darkness, angling toward the riverbank before vanishing into the black water. Those images, faint and fleeting, grew heavier when the news of Angela's disappearance spread the next morning. The evening began as nothing more than a mother driving to pick up her child. But by the time the sun rose over Lafayette, that simple errand had turned into a mystery that would shake the town for decades. When daylight touched the Atchafalaya River, the first search teams were already preparing their boats, unaware that the water was about to become the center of a desperate hunt by the following morning. The quiet streets of Lafayette were overtaken by urgency. Police vehicles lined the roads leading to the Atchafalaya Bridge. Riverboats fanned out across the current, while helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights scanning the murky surface. Officers swept the banks with flashlights, pushing through reeds and mud, while yellow tape cordoned off the area around the bridge. The search for Angela Whitmore had begun with the same intensity reserved for a disaster. Word spread quickly, and it did not take long before the entire town seemed to be involved. Volunteers formed long lines along the riverbank, some carrying poles to push through the water's edge, others dragging nets through tangled reeds. Church leaders organized prayer circles at St. John's, where candlelight vigils burned late into the night. Local news stations aired updates every hour, their anchors repeating Angela's name until it became a constant echo in homes and workplaces across Lafayette. Soon, posters bearing her face were everywhere. Hastily printed sheets with Angela's gentle smile and the bold words "Missing Mother" covered telephone poles, grocery store boards, and the windows of diners where neighbors gathered. Her image looked back at the community in every direction, a reminder that the mother who had once hurried through these same streets was now gone without a trace. For 3 long days, the search turned up nothing. Boats dragged the waters, dogs tracked the banks, and still, the Ford Explorer did not surface. Hope began to thin, but the 4th day brought a chilling discovery. A small group of volunteers pushing through reeds near the riverbank spotted something caught in the mud. It was a woman's white sandal, soaked and caked with dirt. The moment it was lifted from the grass, an older woman standing nearby collapsed. In tears, it was Helen, Angela's mother. She recognized the sandal immediately. It belonged to her daughter. The find sent shock through the entire search effort. For Angela's family, it was a wound that cut deeper than words, and for the town, it was the first sign that the river may have already claimed her. Newspapers carried the image of the muddy sandal the following morning, and the sight of it left Lafayette in a silence heavier than any sermon. The discovery confirmed one terrible truth. Angela's disappearance was no longer simply a missing persons case. It was something darker, and it forced investigators to turn their eyes toward those closest to her. As investigators studied the muddy sandal, new voices began to step forward with uneasy memories. A woman recalled seeing Angela and Chuck earlier that same day at the parking lot of a Winn-Dixie supermarket. She remembered Angela's face streaked with tears while Chuck's grip was tight around a set of car keys. They argued so loudly that shoppers turned to look, but within moments they stormed off in opposite directions. To the woman, it was unsettling. To investigators, it painted a possible picture of a marriage on the edge. Not long after, another account reached the police. A truck driver, passing across the Atchafalaya Bridge late that night, reported catching sight of a woman who looked very much like Angela. She stood near the entrance of the bridge, beside a tall man with long hair pulled back and a worn leather jacket. The two appeared to be arguing, their movements sharp and tense, before the truck moved past and darkness swallowed the scene. The driver could not recall the man's face, but the image of that figure lingered. Police questioned Chuck again, this time pressing him harder. His answers shifted, his timeline bent under scrutiny, and his eyes rarely met the officers in the room. He claimed that he spent the evening at home, but his story left gaps wide enough for suspicion to grow. When investigators checked nearby surveillance cameras, they found nothing. The supermarket tapes that might have confirmed the argument had already been erased, routinely recorded over in the following days. Then came a detail that stood out above the rest. Forensic teams inspected Chuck's pickup truck and found mud clinging to the undercarriage and caked into the grooves of the tires. Samples showed it was the same type of damp soil pulled from the banks of the Atchafalaya River where Angela's sandal had been found. When asked, Chuck dismissed it calmly. He told officers that he had been fishing the weekend before, that the mud must have come from there. But the forensic report told another story. The soil was still damp, fresh enough that it could not have come from a trip taken days earlier. The pieces did not fit neatly, but together they pointed in troubling directions. Witnesses saw arguments, the husband's story faltered, and his truck carried the very earth from the river where Angela was last seen. The search for truth was no longer about where Angela had gone, but about who might have wanted her gone. And just as suspicion mounted, a chilling statement from someone close to Angela would echo louder than any evidence the police had in their hands. When investigators struggled to piece together the fragments of that summer night, a friend stepped forward with a revelation that shook the case. Linda Carver, Angela's closest confidant, told officers of late-night phone calls where Angela's voice trembled with fear. In one call, Angela confessed that if anything ever happened to her, they should look toward Chuck first. Linda repeated those words carefully, her voice breaking as she recalled the weight of her friend's warning. To the police, it was not just a memory, it was a message from Angela herself. A message that now pressed suspicion even harder on her husband. But the mystery only grew darker. Weeks after Angela's disappearance, the Lafayette police station received a late-night call. The line crackled with static, and a man's raspy voice slipped through. He muttered that they would never find her. Before officers could trace the signal, the call cut off. The words lingered in the room like a curse, adding to the unease already surrounding the case. Was it a cruel stranger playing a game, or was it someone who knew exactly where Angela was? Despite all the searching, all the questions, and all the rumors, nothing new appeared. No body, no vehicle, no trace of the missing mother. The sandal and the whispers of witnesses were all that investigators had. Days turned to weeks, and weeks stretched into months. By January of 2002, 6 months after that night, the search was officially scaled back. Angela's file was marked as a cold case, tucked away in the department's storage where countless other unsolved mysteries rested. For Lafayette, the frenzy of headlines and vigils began to fade. But for Angela's family, the silence was unbearable. The unanswered questions only grew heavier with time, and in that silence, A family and a town would soon divide over who they truly believed was responsible. As months slipped into years, the frenzy around Angela's disappearance slowly faded from Lafayette's streets. The posters peeled from telephone poles, the headlines shrank to the back pages, and the search parties dissolved into memory. Life in the town resumed its quiet rhythm, but for Angela's family, the silence was unbearable. Every birthday of her children, every holiday at St. John's Church, carried a shadow that never left. Her mother Helen refused to let go. Each evening she lit a single candle in front of Angela's photograph, whispering prayers that one day the truth would come to light. Neighbors who passed by her red brick home saw the same flickering glow in the window and knew the vigil had not ended. Helen remained certain that Chuck had played a role, and she told anyone who would listen that her daughter would never have left her children unless she was forced. Angela's brother Michael, however, believed something else. He leaned toward the story told by the truck driver on the bridge. In his mind, the long-haired man in the leather jacket was the key to everything. He believed that stranger intervened on the night Angela disappeared and that Chuck had been unfairly cast as the only suspect. The disagreement split the family further, leaving them unable to find comfort in shared grief. Then, in 2003, an envelope arrived at the Lafayette police station. Inside was a single sheet of paper. In hurried handwriting it read, "She is in the water. Look under the bridge." The note was disturbing, but with no other evidence to follow, it was placed in a file and left to gather dust. Years passed, until 2010, when a young officer reviewing old cases stumbled across the same letter. He urged his superiors to authorize a renewed search of the Atchafalaya with updated sonar technology, but without fresh leads or new funding, the request was denied. The file was closed again, leaving the river undisturbed and the mystery buried beneath its waters. The town of Lafayette had moved on, but under the surface of the Atchafalaya, something remained hidden, waiting for the day it would finally rise. Decades had passed when the waters of the Atchafalaya finally gave up their secret. In the summer of 2021, a volunteer team known as the Bayou Recovery Unit brought their boat to Lafayette. They were well known across Louisiana for recovering vehicles and remains from rivers that police had long given up on. On that hot August morning, their sonar swept across the water, sending ripples of data to a glowing screen. First, the images looked like nothing more than shadows in the mud. Then the shape sharpened, a roofline, 4 meters long, a body buried beneath years of silt. The team locked the coordinates. A diver dropped into the water, light cutting through the murk, until his hand pressed against rusted metal. Brushing away algae, he uncovered a trace of green paint. A flashlight beam moved across the rear. Slowly, the numbers on the license plate came into view. They matched perfectly. It was Angela Whitmore's Ford Explorer. Carefully, the divers forced the rear door. The hinges screamed as thick mud poured out. In the driver's seat, a human form rested, bones curled forward, ribs still wrapped in shreds of clothing. On one finger, a silver wedding ring still gleamed through the grime. Beside the remains lay an old Nokia phone cracked and stained with algae, and a torn wallet containing faded photographs of 2 smiling children. The divers froze, knowing they were looking at fragments of a life buried for 20 years. The deeper they searched, the more questions they uncovered. The driver's window was half open, as if someone had tried to escape, or as if another person had slipped out before the car sank. In the trunk, they found a paper map, fragile and water-damaged, with red circles drawn around points of the bridge. No one could explain who marked those spots or why. And on the back seat, almost hidden in the silt, they discovered something strange. A fountain pen engraved with the initials MW. Angela's friends had never known her to own such an item, raising the possibility that someone else had been inside the car that night. The recovery was more than just a discovery of a vehicle. It was the sudden return of every fear and suspicion that had haunted Lafayette for 20 years. The river had given Angela back, but it also carried with it new mysteries that pointed to more than one pair of hands. As the remains were lifted to the surface and the evidence sealed away, investigators realized that the story of Angela Whitmore was no longer about a disappearance. It was about to become a homicide case that would tear open every forgotten file and every buried suspicion. When the Ford Explorer was hauled out of the Atchafalaya and the remains were brought to Baton Rouge, the coroner's office moved quickly. Bones were laid carefully on a metal table under bright white lights, and the testing began. Within days, the results confirmed what the town already suspected. The DNA was a perfect match. After 20 years, Angela Whitmore had finally been found, but with that confirmation came evidence no one was prepared for. Blood traces were recovered from the steering wheel and driver's seat of the Explorer. Testing revealed that part of that blood belonged to Charles Chuck Whitmore, for a man who claimed he had no connection to what happened that night. His blood in the driver's area was a discovery that investigators could not ignore. Then came an even more chilling result. Samples taken from beneath Angela's fingernails, preserved in the mud and protected by the cold water, revealed fragments of skin that carried DNA. It was not Chuck's, it belonged to an unidentified male, a profile with no match in the national database. The evidence suggested Angela had fought for her life, and in that struggle, left behind the trace of another man entirely. With these discoveries, the case could no longer sit in storage. A special task force was formed, combining the Lafayette Police, the Louisiana State Police, forensic specialists, and with added support from the FBI. Old files were pulled from cabinets. Interrogation notes were dusted off, and the overlooked details of 2001 were given new life under fresh eyes. Soon after, the Lafayette Police Department stood before cameras at a press conference that reached every corner of Louisiana. The commander's voice was steady but heavy as he announced that the body was Angela Whitmore, that her death was now officially ruled a homicide, and that the case had been fully reopened. For the people of Lafayette, the story that had become a quiet memory in the background of their town was suddenly alive again, and with it came a storm of questions. And as headlines spread and whispers filled church pews and coffee shops, new revelations were about to make the community question everything they thought they knew. The announcement that Angela's case was now a confirmed homicide spread like wildfire. Newspapers from Lafayette to Baton Rouge filled their front pages with photographs of the rusted Ford Explorer being lifted from the water. Televisions replayed the silver wedding ring, the Nokia phone, and the haunting image of Bones still seated behind the wheel. For the first time in 2 decades, the name Angela Whitmore was on every tongue across Louisiana. In Lafayette, the reaction was immediate. Crowds gathered at St. John's Church, where candlelight vigils stretched late into the night. Families brought flowers, neighbors bowed their heads, and prayers rose in unison. For many, it was a moment of mourning, but for others, it was also a moment of anger. They wanted justice, and they wanted it quickly. Then came a revelation that added fuel to the fire. Robert Lane, a retired officer who had worked on the original 2001 investigation, stepped forward on a local radio program. His voice was bitter as he recalled an encounter that had weighed on him for years. He claimed that Charles Chuck Whitmore once approached him with an envelope of money, asking him to ease off the investigation. Lane said he had reported it, but his warning was buried and ignored. His words hit the community like a storm, reviving suspicion that had never fully died. The shock deepened when Angela's eldest daughter, now an adult, broke her silence on camera. With eyes red from tears, she declared that she believed her father had killed her mother. She pointed to the blood evidence found in the driver's seat as proof that could not be explained away. Her words cut through Lafayette, splitting the town further. Some stood firmly with Angela's family, demanding an arrest, while others struggled to believe that the man they had seen raising children and sitting in church pews could have done such a thing. The community was divided. The headlines were relentless, and the air grew heavier with tension. And just as emotions reached their peak, investigators uncovered a financial trail that linked Chuck to someone long whispered about in the shadows. As suspicion rose against Chuck Whitmore, investigators turned their eyes toward the money. 3 months after Angela was declared legally dead, Chuck had collected a life insurance payout worth $500,000. At first glance, it looked like a grieving husband securing a future for his children. But when forensic accountants traced the movement of that money, a different story began to take shape. The bulk of the payout cleared debts and paid off the mortgage. Yet a portion of the money, more than $50,000, followed a strange path. It slipped through several small accounts, bouncing like a stone across water, before landing in the name of a man investigators had heard before. Mark Walters. That name sent a chill through the room. Walters was the long-haired man in a leather jacket seen on the Atchafalaya Bridge the night Angela disappeared. For years he had existed only in witness accounts, a blurred figure at the edge of memory. Now, financial records tied him directly to Chuck. The connection was no longer a rumor. It was money, traceable and undeniable. The discovery raised questions that struck at the heart of the case. Why had Chuck funneled money to Walters? Was it payment for silence? Was it a reward for help in moving the explorer into the river? Or was it something darker? An arrangement that ended with Angela's life. When police attempted to track Walters, they found nothing. Since 2002, he had vanished completely. No address, no active phone line, not even tax filings. It was as though he had been erased. With only an old protest photo showing his face, the authorities issued a statewide alert. Walters was now wanted for questioning in Angela Whitmore's case. For investigators, the trail of money turned Angela's disappearance from a family tragedy into a conspiracy that involved more than one man. And with Walters now back in the spotlight, they began digging for the pieces of Angela's life that hinted at the fear she carried in her final days. As investigators pressed further, they uncovered pieces of Angela's private world that revealed the depth of her fear. Hidden among old evidence boxes was her personal diary. The pages were lined with shaky handwriting, stained with tears, and filled with confessions that no one in Lafayette had ever seen. Angela wrote of feeling trapped, of being constantly watched inside her own home, and of her growing determination to leave Chuck. She described her plans for divorce and her worry that he would never allow her to go in peace. Tucked between the final entries was a letter she never mailed. The paper was yellowed and creased, as if it had been folded many times in her hands. In it, Angela asked whoever found it to take care of her daughters if she disappeared. The last line was chilling. She wrote that Chuck would never give her freedom. That letter, unsent, yet undeniable, felt like a final plea before her voice was silenced. As investigators re-examined old witness accounts, neighbors from across the street remembered the night of Angela's disappearance. They spoke of loud shouting, coming from the Whitmore home, objects breaking, and then a sudden quiet that hung heavy in the air. At the time, they dismissed it as another household argument, but in the shadow of what was later found in the river, those memories carried far more weight. Forensics added another crucial piece. When experts examined Chuck's old pickup, they compared the undercarriage to the Ford Explorer recovered from the Atchafalaya. What they found was striking. Scrape marks from Angela's vehicle matched perfectly with green paint, transferred onto Chuck's truck more than 20 years earlier. The layers of paint, preserved through time, locked together like puzzle pieces. It was the first physical evidence linking Chuck directly to the Explorer that carried Angela to her death. The picture of that summer night was becoming clearer. But every answer only led to more troubling questions, and soon, investigators would capture words from Chuck himself that revealed he may have hidden far more than anyone imagined. With new physical evidence building against him, investigators sought something even stronger. They turned to surveillance. A judge granted a warrant to wiretap Chuck's phone. For weeks, they listened to his daily conversations. Most of them were ordinary, filled with small talk about church gatherings, grocery lists, and simple family matters. But then, one evening, they caught something that froze the room. Chuck's voice dropped low and tense. He muttered that they would never find that bridge again. It sounded like a man speaking to himself, confident that the river had buried his secret forever. Those words were recorded, and they would later echo inside a courtroom. At the same time, investigators approached Chuck's grown son. For years he had stayed silent, but now he was ready to speak. His memory went back to the very night Angela disappeared. He recalled standing on the porch as a child when his father pulled him close. Chuck's grip was tight, his eyes red, and he told the boy that whatever he heard that night must never be repeated. The son admitted that the memory haunted him through his childhood, but fear had kept him quiet. Now, with the evidence mounting, he broke that silence and gave his testimony. The final step was bold. Investigators staged an undercover call. They had an officer use a raspy voice to mimic the description of Walters, the long-haired man seen on the bridge. The call reached Chuck's phone one October evening. The disguised voice told him that the police were getting close and that the past could not stay hidden. On the other end of the line, Chuck panicked. He shouted that he had already paid in full, that it was done 20 years ago, and that if Angela had not fought back, everything would have been finished. The entire exchange was recorded. For the investigators, it was no longer suspicion or rumor. It was Chuck Whitmore's own words admitting that he had been at the river that night. The mask Chuck had worn for 2 decades was beginning to break, and soon the law would catch up. With the man Lafayette once believed was nothing more than a grieving husband, by May of 2022, the net around Charles Chuck Whitmore had tightened beyond escape. After months of reviewing the recordings, the son's testimony, and the mounting forensic evidence, a judge signed an arrest warrant. On a quiet Monday morning, as Chuck prepared to leave his home for a church meeting, unmarked police cars rolled into the neighborhood. Officers stepped onto the front lawn, and neighbors watering their gardens watched in stunned silence as sirens cut through the air. Chuck froze on his porch, keys in hand. The lead officer called his name and announced the charge of second-degree murder in the death of his wife, Angela Whitmore. The man who had spent 2 decades building the image of a devoted father and faithful parishioner now stood wide-eyed and pale as handcuffs closed around his wrists. Television cameras, already tipped off, captured the moment. Within hours, his image spread across Louisiana, no longer the face of a grieving husband, but of an accused killer, as he was taken into custody. Another team entered the red brick house with a search warrant. Every room was combed, every cabinet opened. In the basement, behind an old closet door, they found a small wooden box, carefully wrapped. Inside lay a single object that made investigators pause. It was a Ford Explorer key, rusted and stained. The same model that had been buried beneath the Atchafalaya River for 2 decades. Why had Chuck kept that key? Was it a twisted reminder of the night his wife vanished, or a token he believed would never be discovered? Whatever the reason, the discovery was sealed in evidence and carried out of the house. Neighbors watched from their porches, whispering to one another, some in disbelief, others shaking their heads as if their long suspicions had finally been confirmed. The arrest shook Lafayette to its core. Coffee shops buzzed with arguments, church pews filled with uneasy glances, and the town split between those who believed Chuck was guilty and those who could not accept that the man they had trusted for so long could be capable of murder. But the Ford Explorer key was not the only revelation to challenge Chuck's carefully built mask. Soon, more voices would rise from the past, telling stories that painted him in a far darker light. The arrest of Chuck Whitmore split Lafayette down the middle. On one side stood crowds holding signs that read, "Justice for Angela," voices rising in anger that it had taken 20 years to reach this moment. On the other side were neighbors who had watched Chuck raise his children, attend every church service, and volunteer for countless community events. To them, he was still the father who read scripture at Sunday gatherings and taught his children to ride their bikes on quiet streets. The town that once moved in harmony now found itself locked in heated arguments across coffee counters and church pews. Amid this storm, another voice added to the growing portrait of Chuck's hidden past. Deborah Collins, a woman who had worked at a local auto shop years earlier, stepped forward with a memory she had buried. She claimed that in 1999, Chuck cornered her at the shop, grabbing her wrist and whispering crude words. Terrified, she quit shortly after. At the time, no one believed her story. Chuck's reputation as a polite family man overshadowed her accusation. But now, with Angela's case reopened and the town on edge, Deborah's testimony painted him in a new and disturbing light. As the trial approached, Chuck's defense team knew they needed to strike back. They introduced a theory that shocked Angela's family. The defense claimed Angela had taken her own life, driving into the river to escape pressures she could no longer bear. To strengthen this claim, they produced a cassette tape, its crackling sound filling the courtroom. On it, a woman's voice sobbed and said she wanted to disappear, that she no longer had the strength to go on. The defense insisted this was Angela's final cry, evidence that her death was no murder, but a tragic choice. The recording left the courtroom unsettled. Some wondered if Angela had truly been so desperate, but her family rejected the tape outright. They argued she would never leave her daughters by choice. Prosecutors were equally skeptical. They handed the tape to audio experts, who examined its strange pauses, clipped sentences, and unusual background noises. The analysis suggested splicing and manipulation, pieces stitched together to form a false message. If true, the recording was not Angela's voice at all, but a tool meant to confuse and mislead. With every revelation, the case became more tangled. Supporters clashed, memories resurfaced, and the trial loomed over Lafayette like a storm cloud ready to break. And soon, the courtroom would hear testimony from the one man who had remained a ghost for 20 years. When the trial finally opened, Lafayette felt as if the entire state of Louisiana had turned its eyes on the courthouse. Reporters filled the steps, satellite trucks lined the street, and families from across the parish crowded benches just to glimpse the man accused of hiding his wife's death for more than 20 years. Inside, the air was heavy with tension as the judge called the court to order. The prosecution began with their pillars of evidence. They painted Angela as a woman preparing to leave her marriage, filing for divorce, and confiding to friends that she feared her husband. They pointed to the life insurance payout, $500,000 claimed only months after her disappearance, and described it as the financial motive behind the crime. They spoke of opportunity, reminding the jury that Chuck was home with Angela that evening, that neighbors heard arguing, and that his timeline was riddled with gaps. Then they laid out the physical evidence. Blood in the driver's area of the Explorer linked to Chuck. Scrape marks and green paint from Angela's car matched perfectly to Chuck's old pickup. A Ford Explorer key hidden in his basement, sealed away like a grim trophy. His son's memory of being warned into silence. On the porch. And finally, the words captured on a wiretap where Chuck muttered that no one would ever find the bridge again. Piece by piece, they argued, the picture became clear. The jury then heard from the experts. The coroner described Angela's remains, pointing out marks on her bones that showed signs of a struggle. The dive team testified about the recovery, recalling the haunting sight of the skeleton still seated behind the wheel with a wedding ring glinting on her hand. They showed the jury photographs of the vehicle, the half-open window, the torn wallet, and the map marked with red circles around the bridge. Each image tightened the grip of evidence around Chuck, but the defense struck back forcefully. They reminded the jury that there were no eyewitnesses to a murder. No one had seen Chuck harm Angela. No one had watched him drive the car into the river. They stressed the unknown male DNA found beneath Angela's fingernails, raising doubt about whether another man had been the true culprit. They pointed to the cassette tape that played a woman's voice describing her wish to disappear, and argued that Angela may have chosen her own end. The courtroom became a battlefield of narratives, each side clashing to shape the truth. The jury sat with pens moving across paper, their faces unreadable as both sides fought to anchor doubt or certainty in their minds. And then came the moment that shifted the entire trial. The arrival of the long-haired man who had once been nothing more than a shadow at the bridge. When the prosecution announced that Mark Walters had finally been located, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. After 2 decades of silence, the long-haired man once glimpsed at the Atchafalaya Bridge was brought back from a small Texas town to face questions that had haunted Lafayette for years. As he entered the courtroom, older and worn from years, on the run, the atmosphere shifted. Jurors leaned forward, the audience murmured, and Angela's family fixed their eyes on the man who might hold the missing pieces of the puzzle. On the stand, Walters did not deny his connection. In a raspy voice, he admitted that in 2001, Chuck had come to him in panic. He said Chuck told him Angela was already dead and begged for help in disposing of the vehicle. Walters confessed that he accepted $50,000 to drive the Ford Explorer to the river and push it into the water. He described the moment the headlights vanished beneath the surface and how he left Louisiana soon after, disappearing to avoid the law. But when pressed further, Walters shook his head and insisted he had not harmed Angela. He claimed his role began only after her death and that he never laid a hand on her. His words drew gasps from the audience, some believing he was telling the truth, others convinced he was minimizing his involvement. The defense seized on his testimony, pointing out that the unidentified DNA found under Angela's fingernails could easily belong to Walters. They argued that if he admitted to touching the car, why could he not also be the one who fought with Angela? In her final moments, the suggestion cast a shadow over the courtroom, heightening the tension among jurors who scribbled notes with furrowed brows. For the prosecution, Walters' admission was a gift and a curse. It proved Chuck had paid another man to cover up the crime, but his denial of direct involvement muddied the waters. The truth now balanced between two men, each carrying part of a dark secret, and the jury was left to decide whose hands were truly stained with Angela's final struggle. As the trial pressed forward, the defense revealed a surprise piece of evidence they believed would turn doubt into reasonable doubt, shaking the courtroom to its core. As the courtroom reeled from Mark Walters' testimony, the defense moved to strike a decisive blow. They produced what they claimed was Angela's own farewell, a handwritten letter discovered in an old storage box. The folded paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting shaky, and the message chilling. It suggested Angela was tired of her life, that she wanted to disappear, and that no one should search for her. The defense attorney held it high before the jury, arguing it was proof Angela had chosen her own fate, not the victim of her husband's hands. The effect was immediate. Murmurs rippled through the audience, and Angela's daughters wept openly, insisting the writing did not belong to their mother. The defense pressed on, framing the letter as the missing piece of their narrative. If Angela wished to vanish, then the entire case against Chuck was nothing more than grief turned into blame. But the prosecution demanded that the document undergo a full forensic review. A handwriting expert examined the curves and spacing, noting inconsistencies that did not match Angela's known journals. Then came the more devastating finding. The ink was not consistent with pens available in 2001. Tests revealed it came from an inkjet printer model released years later, in 2005. The supposed farewell letter could not have been written before Angela's disappearance. It was a forgery. The revelation struck the courtroom like thunder. The judge reprimanded the defense for presenting unverified evidence and ordered the jury to weigh its credibility carefully. The credibility of the entire defense strategy began to crumble, leaving their suicide theory weak and unstable. With the letter exposed as a fraud, the prosecution's case grew stronger. But the real test was yet to come, as the jury would soon be asked to decide whether suspicion and fragments of evidence were enough to seal a man's fate. When closing arguments ended, the weight of 2 decades of mystery passed into the hands of 12 jurors. They carried stacks of reports, photographs of the Explorer, transcripts of testimony, and the haunting memory of Angela's diary and final unsent letter. Inside the deliberation room, the debate stretched for hours. Some pointed to Chuck's blood on the steering wheel, the paint match between his truck and Angela's vehicle, and his own recorded admission. Others hesitated, raising the shadow of the unknown DNA found under Angela's fingernails and the testimony of Walters, who insisted he only disposed of the car. The arguments circled until exhaustion set in. Finally, the jurors reached a decision they believed reflected both the evidence and the uncertainty that lingered. When they returned to the courtroom, silence fell across the benches. The foreperson rose and delivered the words Lafayette had waited more than 20 years to hear. On the charge of first-degree murder, Charles Whitmore was found not guilty. On the charge of second-degree murder, he was found guilty. Chuck slumped into his chair as his daughters clutched each other, their tears flowing freely. The judge pronounced his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel fell, sealing his fate. The man who had lived as a model father and faithful parishioner for 2 decades was now condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the courtroom's work was not finished. Mark Walters, tried separately, faced charges of concealing a crime and obstructing justice. His trial moved quickly, and the jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, finally paying for his role in hiding Angela's death. The case that began with a mother's disappearance on a summer night had ended with 2 men sentenced, one for murder and one for concealment. Yet even as the judge closed the final file, a single question refused to die. Whose DNA had Angela fought to keep under her nails? When the verdict was read and the sentences delivered, Angela's family stood together in the courthouse hallway. Her mother, Helen, frail but unshaken, told reporters that justice had come late, but it had come. She said that her daughter could finally rest, though her absence would never stop hurting. Angela's daughters, now grown women, spoke through tears. They said they had lived their entire lives under the shadow of doubt, but the truth had finally been spoken out loud. Their voices trembled with both relief and grief, for no sentence could ever give them back the mother they lost. In Lafayette, the community began to heal. St. John's Church, once divided between those defending Chuck and those condemning him, held a reconciliation service. Candles lined the altar as families prayed for Angela's soul, for her children, and even for the man who had once knelt among them, pretending to be a grieving husband. From the pulpit, the priest reminded them that facades can last for years, but truth will always find its way through the cracks. Still, not every question had been answered. The prosecutor, standing before cameras, pledged that the investigation would continue. The unidentified male DNA found inside the Explorer and beneath Angela's fingernails would not be forgotten. It belonged to someone, and that someone still carried a secret. The case had delivered justice, but it had also left behind a thread that tugged at the edge of the truth. Angela's story became a symbol of what time, persistence, and community vigilance can achieve. It showed how technology, like sonar and DNA analysis, could raise answers from the mud of a river after 2 silent decades. It showed that secrets, buried beneath water, lies, and facades could one day surface. No matter how carefully hidden, Angela Whitmore's life ended on a summer night. But her truth rose years later, carried by the determination of those who refused to forget her name. And now her story closes with justice, but also with a lingering chill, leaving us to ask how many more truths remain hidden in the shadows of small towns and winding rivers. If you are still watching this story, it means it touched you and it deserves your like and your subscribe. Please help me reach the goal of 5,000 likes, a target set by my mother for you. And tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story. Your support keeps unscripted tales alive, bringing justice and remembrance to stories that should never be forgotten.